All right, Unit 2 for CRIJ 1301, Introduction to Criminal Justice. In this unit, we'll be talking about laying the foundation about defining crime and law, talking about the elements that are needed or required to prove that a crime has happened and that a suspect has committed that crime. Maybe even talk a little bit about criminal defenses, though that may come later in the semester. All right, so let's talk first about what crime is. I want to give you 4 important definitions. So I hope you're taking notes as you watch the video. So in defining crime, you have to start with social norms. And we talked about social norms in the last unit. Social norms are your basic definition. Social norm is the expected behavior for people in society. It's how we expect members of society to act in any given situation. It's important to know that norms vary from group to group within society. We have, the larger American culture, which has its norms, but then there are subcultures and subgroups in the United States, and each group has its own set of social norms, and sometimes you get some cultural conflict in that what one group believes is wrong may not hold true for another. There are certain behaviors that some groups will think are perfectly acceptable. Other groups will think they're wrong. Think about things like marijuana use or abortion, these topics that we often call controversial. And those topics tend to become controversial because of differing social norms between cultural groups. Norms are also subject to interpretation, and they are fluid, meaning they change over time. Probably the best example of that is tobacco use, specifically cigarettes. If you're a movie buff like I am, and I really do enjoy watching, I like watching old movies. If you look back to the movies made in the 50s and 60s, you'll notice everybody smokes. Good guys, bad guys, it doesn't matter. The hero smokes. The bad guys smoke, the heroes smoke, everyone smokes. And that holds true to the 50s, 60s, even the 70s. And then the 80s, there was a large campaign, to get people to cut down smoking. We started to take the Surgeon General's warning a little more seriously. And smoking went from being a social norm to being more taboo. And we saw that change. You get into late 80s, 90s television, particularly in this millennia, and name me a modern made movie about modern times where the protagonist smokes. You'll see anti-heroes smoke, but the pure white hat good guy heroes in modern television series and movies, unless they're set in a 60s, 70s type era, the good guys don't smoke it. And it's a subtle thing that you notice if you watch enough movies. But it's a good example of how our social norms have changed. While it is not illegal to smoke, and plenty of people still do, it has become more and more to be considered deviant behavior. Give it another 10, 20 years, and you will probably you'll be hard pressed to find people that smoke. It will take a while, but you'll eventually get to the point where the anti-smoking thing becomes the social norm. Now, when people engage in behavior that violates the social norm, that is what we call deviance. And all deviance is a violation of a social norm. Now, be mindful that while deviance is a violation of a social norm, it may not be a violation of the law. Like I said in the last year, like cussing in church. There's nothing illegal about using profanity in church. It is a violation of the social norm, which means it is deviant behavior. And it's important to make that distinction between deviant behavior and law and the violation of law, which is a crime. Because there are a lot of actions that someone can commit that are considered deviant but not illegal. And there are some illegal acts that are not considered deviant, like exceeding the speed limit. Think about, think about your own driving habits. It is fairly common for people to take an extra 5 on the speed limit. That there's this belief out there that as long as you're not exceeding the speed limit by more than 5 miles an hour, you're not going to get pulled over. You're not going to get a ticket. People get really mad, at a police officer who pulls them over and issues them a citation when they were only going 1 or 2 miles over the speed limit. But the reality is, that it's right in the name of the thing, speed limit. And even a half a mile, if you're in a 40 mile an hour zone, you're going 40 and a half miles an hour, you're violating the law, and you are vulnerable to citation. But we'll get mad because we'll think, well, everybody does it, and it's not true. Not everyone speeds, but a lot of people do. And while it is illegal to exceed the speed limit, it is not deviant. In other words, it's not a violation of our social norms to run through to go 85, 90 miles an hour down I-35. So you'll probably get a ticket. All right, so that's social norms and deviance. So that's 2 of our 4 terms. The next 2 form a group. So, social norm and deviance, they form one group. And then law and crime form another connected group. Law is codified social norms. Now, codified, I used that word in the last unit. It's a fancy word that basically means that the law is written down. Okay, and to be more specific, a law is a social norm that has been codified, has been enacted into law by a governing body with the authority to do so, such as the Texas legislature or the United States Congress. These are bodies that have, legislative bodies have the authority to make law. Violation of law then is crime. Sometimes we see people do stuff and go, that ought to be illegal, and it's not, and so it's not a crime. Crimes are things that are violations of the law. It's a codified black letter law. And like I said before, they are not necessarily deviant. Not all deviant actions are illegal, and not all illegal actions are deviant. But for the study of criminal justice, it's important that we look at both, because often a propensity to commit deviant acts can be an indicator that an individual is also willing to commit illegal acts. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about the law. So what is law? In essence, if I'm going to give you a fancy definition, always good to remember the fancy definitions, because the fancy definitions, are the ones that show up on tests. But a law is a formal means of social control. Remember from last unit, talked a bit about social control, and that the criminal justice system is a formal institution of social control. Well, the law is our formal means of social control, and it involves the use of rules that are created, interpreted, and enforceable by specially designated persons in a particular political community. And you can probably guess who that specifically designated persons are: the police. And I say particular political community because just because something is legal or illegal in one state doesn't mean it's legal in another. Take gambling, for instance. You go someplace like Shreveport, Louisiana, or Nevada, mostly the entire state, and perfectly legal to gamble. However, if I'm operating a gambling den, just off of the main drag in Austin, then I'm breaking the law. All right, so that's why we talk about particular political community or particular geographic area, because what is against the law in one area may not necessarily be against the law in another. That can apply to nations. That can apply between states. That can apply between cities. Some cities have city ordinances that make it illegal to commit certain actions where 2 cities over you can do it. Think about the county level. In Texas, we have these things called dry counties where you can't buy liquor. I remember living in a dry county once, and everyone just, when we went to go buy a bottle of whiskey or whatever, you just crossed the county line, and there was always a liquor store just on the other side of the county line. Because in one county, illegal to sell liquor, the other one it is, particular political community or geographic area. What's the purpose of law? Well, law does 4 things for us. It creates stability. It protects both private and public interests. It provides for the orderly resolution of conflict, and it upholds and sometimes changes traditions and institutions. When we talk about law, I'd also like to get into 3 different types of law. And really what I'm talking about is 3 different dichotomies. Now, a dichotomy is like a pair of terms. Criminal, like we talk about a little bit about when we're defining crime. Social norms and deviance made one paired group, and law and crime made another paired group of terms, and together you have 2 dichotomies, 2 pairs. In this case, I want to give you 3 pairs of terms that are related to one another, dealing with the law. And again, hopefully you're taking notes because these are certainly things that would show up on an exam. The first pair of terms is substantive versus procedural law. Substantive law is what we're used to seeing in the law books. Your fancy find it on a test definition of substantive law is that substantive law is the body of law that creates, discovers, and defines the rights and obligations of each person in society. And so when we say something is against the law, so the state of Texas makes a law against, making your own lottery tickets. Okay, the law would say, here is this thing that it is your obligation as a member of society not to do. When we say it creates and discovers and defines the rights of people, well, we have the right not to have people break into our homes and take our stuff. And so the law defines that right by making it illegal for someone to break into your home and take your stuff. Now, substantive law has 2 key elements that you should be aware of. Specificity. In other words, the law must be specific as to what is prescribed or prohibited or required. And so the way the law is written, it must be very specific. Specificity means that the law has to be very specific about what it is outlawing or what it is requiring people to do. The law cannot be vague. In fact, there's a legal principle called void for vagueness. That means when the law is not written specifically, then the law itself is void because it's vague. The second key element of substantive law is penalty. That means that there must be a penalty. A law that doesn't have some consequence for its violation isn't a law. It's a guideline or a principle, but it's not a law. Um, give you an example. It's a little weak, but it's an example. I used to teach at a university that a much smaller university, and of course we had parking regulations like every university, and we had faculty parking. Um, but quite frequently, students would park in faculty parking, and but we had no traffic. We had no real traffic enforcement, no parking enforcement. And so there was no penalty for parking. There was no penalty for students that parked in faculty parking. And because there was no penalty, it really wasn't a rule. It wasn't a law because it had no penalty. All right, so that substantive law with its two elements, specificity and penalty. Opposite substantive law is procedural law. Procedural law is a type of statutory law that governs the administration of law in the courts. In other words, it's the rules that need to be followed in the court. For example, last week I alluded to something called the exclusionary rule. The concept, the procedural law that basically states that if the police illegally seize evidence in other words, they seize evidence in violation of the Fourth Amendment, that evidence cannot be used at trial. That's a procedural law. It governs how we administer law in the court system. And so all the rules of evidence that lawyers have to follow during the trial process, all of that is procedural law. Okay. The next pair of terms is statutory versus case law. Statutory law are laws passed by a legislative body that is typically codified and published by the governing body that passed the law. So it's federal, state, or local, or federal, state, and municipal. Okay, but these are laws passed by a legislative body like the U.S. Congress or the Texas Legislature or your city council that have the lawful authority to make law. Now, where do they get that authority from? Well, they get that authority from us, the governed, through the social contract. In other words, those rights that we give up, we basically give the government the right to rule over us. And in doing so, we give the government the power to make laws. So we always say, well, who's the governor? Who gave him the right to make laws? And, well, we did. We elected him. Whether you voted for him or not, we elected him as a people. Opposite of statutory law is case law. Now, case law is, and there will be people that will argue with you that it's not law, but we call it law. It is law. Case law are laws derived from court decisions that are often based on statutory law and sometimes arrived in the absence of statutes. Again, the exclusionary rule is case law. It was created by the Supreme Court. But now, as case law, it is also procedural law. And so we can see now that in each of these pairs that I've talked about, a particular law falls on one side of each of these pairs. So the law that says that you can't take other people's stuff is statutory law, and it is also substantive law. Finally, we come to the last pair. It's criminal versus civil law. Civil law is the portion of the law that defines and determines the rights of the individual in protecting his person and his property. And I'm not talking about the law that says, someone breaks into your house, you can shoot them. I'm not talking about the castle doctrine here, or stand your ground laws. What we're talking about is I'm driving down North Street, somebody pulls in front of me and causes an accident, damages my property. Civil law comes into play when I take that person to court If they refuse to pay damages, I take them to court and I sue them for damages. Criminal law is the body of the law specifically established to maintain peace and order. Its purpose is to protect society and the community from the injurious acts of individuals. So civil law is about the right of the individual to protect his person and his property. And civil law serves an important purpose. That's why we're not out, you know, if I'm a rancher and somebody comes, you know, some hunter out there gets reckless with his hunting rifle and kills my cow, in the absence of civil law, I just go out and shoot him. I just kill him. I just kill him in revenge. Well, civil law says I don't have to go beat the guy up. I don't got to go shoot him back. I just sue him, and he pays me the damages for killing my cow, and he pays some damages as sort of a civil punishment for killing my cow. Criminal law, on the other hand, protects society and the community. And I want you to remember that during the semester, especially when we talk about policing, in that criminal law protects society as a whole. It protects the community at large. It's not necessarily designed to protect the individual, though it may seem that way. All right, some differences. I'm going to finish up this this particular video talking about differences between civil and criminal law. First, they're different in the way that cases are filed and cited. A civil case is always an individual versus another individual, or a company against a company, or a state versus a state, or somebody versus a company. You can't actually sue a state. That's a different kind of funny thing when you know, if I'm a prison inmate and I want to sue the Texas Department of Criminal Justice because they violated my rights somehow, I don't actually sue TDCJ. I sue the warden of my prison and the director of the Department of Criminal Justice. But that's a little hinky thing there. So it's individuals and corporations against each other. That's how civil cases are filed. Criminal cases are always the state, and by state I mean the governmental body, versus an individual. You know, so a criminal case in Texas is the state of Texas versus Joe Smith. And it's always going to be that way. Criminal cases are always that way, at least to get to the appellate level. But it's always going to be the state, or it might be the United States versus so-and-so, or the city of Nacogdoches versus so-and-so. That's how they're filed. There's a few states that word it a little differently. State of Massachusetts, it's the people of Massachusetts versus so-and-so. In that case, it's because the state, the state, the prosecutor, the government itself represents the victim. And in this case, the victim is all the people. Remember I said that criminal law is about protecting society. And you can see that in the way the state of Massachusetts names their cases. It's the people of Massachusetts. It's not the individual victim versus the offender. It's all the people of Massachusetts versus the offender. It's the state of Texas versus the individual. And then other differences, the nature of the sanctions involved. Criminal law is always about punitive sanctions, and sanctions is a fancy word for punishment. Criminal law involves punitive sanctions, punishment intended to punish people because they've done wrong to society. Civil law is compensatory. In other words, it awards compensation for harm. Let's say you get drunk and run over my mailbox. All right, and so I take you to civil court, and the judge finds, because that's not a lot of money, so that's going to go to a JP or a JP's court. JP is going to say, okay, yeah, you ran over the mailbox, you owe Dr. Day $100 for new mailbox. And the idea is to compensate somebody for harm or damage or suffering imposed by another person's actions. The final difference between civil and criminal law is the standard of proof required. And that's where we'll pick up in the next video, where I explain standards of proof.